I'm especially happy that my friend and colleague, Professor Stephen Aschheim, invited me to be one of the chairs of this encounter. Martin J. is a distinguished professor. He is the Sidney Holman Ehrman Professor of History at the University of California, where he teaches modern European intellectual history. And I think that I will not go through his rich bibliography, his enormous writing in the history of intellectual history, the history of ideas, especially European history of ideas and German history of ideas. As chair, I would like to make only one very, very short introductory note. Because I myself, as a person, as a student, I was very much affected by his extremely important book about the Frankfurt School that was published in 1973, and that was his dissertation, if I don't err, that he has written at Harvard. Why do I mention it? It seems to be an old book, his first book. But this book is extremely important concerning the epistemological meaning of his research and his writings. Because Marty was the first to transform the thought, the ideas of the Frankfurt School, which were molded in a specific atmosphere of crisis and catastrophe. Their writings were reflecting the specific crisis of European existence and especially Jewish existence. And he transformed their writing, their text, in the American environment, true, into something different. Or to put it the other way around, he historicized the writings of the Frankfurt School, which was impregnated by the experience of Weimar and of the early and the beginning German Reich. Insofar, his perspective is a more academic, a more distant, and a perspective which transformed experience into knowledge. I couldn't be here at his first presentation. Reason Eclipsed, and the notion of the Eclipse of Reason is a very important writing by Max Horkheimer, published in 1947. And Marty spoke about the first generation of the Frankfurt School. Today he's going to speak about Reason Regrounded, Habermas' gamble, very ambiguous formulation. I'm eager to hear and to learn from Marty how he, from his perspective, is going possibly to historicize Jürgen Habermas' thought. Marty, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Dan, for that very generous introduction. I've had the privilege of being introduced by Dan on 2 different continents in the past 2 years, in Leipzig as well as here, and it's always an enormous pleasure. I can't obviously recapitulate the argument of the first paper, but just simply to bring those of you who are not here up to speed, it dealt with a crisis in the Frankfurt School's dependence on a notion of rationality, reason, ratio, which led to a number of rather, I thought, desperate expedients in the 1950s and into the 60s, but ended up in a kind of cul-de-sac in which they were still holding on desperately to a notion of reason as an antidote to what they saw as the irrationality not merely of contemporary philosophy, but of the world in which they were immersed. But it was desperate enough that I felt it really did not suffice to do the work they hoped it would do. And so Habermas is the figure in this narrative who comes along, the second generation figure, who recognizes that crisis, recognizes the inadequacy of their position, and comes up with what might be called a meta-critique of the critique of instrumental reason, and tries to do so in such a way that he salvages, so he hopes, a plausible notion of reason. And what I'll try to do today is to outline the basic lineaments of that salvaging. It's far too complex to do justice to in just an hour. And then the third lecture, I'll go into some of the criticisms that are made of Habermas and see what I think still holds up. I mean, I'm basically, just to sort of anticipate myself, on his side in many of these debates, but his critics have created a tremendous discussion around his work, which shows that it is a work in progress and that he himself would be the first to admit that it is not a finished product. All right, so this is an attempt to spell out his, as it were, metacritique of the critique of instrumental reason. Now, what first has to be understood is that his point of departure was a feeling of solidarity with the earlier Frankfurt School's yearning for a viable concept of reason after its eclipse. No theory that could justifiably call itself critical could dispense with the cognitive insights and normative force that had been developed under the rubric of reason. Like Horkheimer, like Adorno, Habermas absorbed the Hegelian lesson that reason, however it might be defined, had to be realizable in history, in human relations, rather than simply conceived transcendentally, naturalistically, contemplatively. He understood the imperative to realize reason practically in the actions, in the institutions of the life world, which meant situated amidst the inevitable diversity of particular cultures and specific bodies with all of their accompanying desires and vulnerabilities. Thus, the question of reason was not a question for philosophy alone, not a question for thought alone, but also for social relations in the everyday world of pre-reflective practices and beliefs, and even more so in the specialist institutions that emerged from it. Habermas thus shared Horkheimer and Adorno's suspicion of a subject-centered notion of reason, one derived from a monologic Cartesian notion of the punctual, let's say the isolated self, abstracted from the world. Such a self, he agreed, was the correlate of the isolated individual whose preservation was its primary goal, and which Horkheimer, you'll recall, had seen as the we might say, project of reason itself, self-preservation. So Habermas understands that reason must get beyond the, we might call it, fortress of the consciousness of a singular subject. But unlike the first generation of critical theorists, Habermas did not pine for the restoration of anything that might be called objective or substantive reason in the emphatic metaphysical sense of the term. Remember that Adorno talked about solidarity with metaphysics at the moment of its fall. While lamenting the hypertrophy of instrumental technological rationality, which he saw, and I'm quoting him, as mirroring the objective one-sidedness of the capitalist modernized life world, he cautioned against reducing it to no more than a handmaiden of reification and domination. Nor did he allow the apparent lessons of the Holocaust to turn him away from the rationalizing project, and that was his term, of the Enlightenment, for all its potential of domination, even as he insisted that his countrymen must face their responsibility for it. So one can see in Habermas the effect of growing up. He was in the Hitler Youth, he grew up during the war, the horror of both, as it were, the irrationality of Nazism, but also of the ways in which reason, in certain of its guises, had been complicitous with that horror. And yet, unlike Adorno and Horkheimer, he somehow moved beyond the trauma of those who had pretty much abandoned hope for getting beyond the eclipse. Instead, Habermas boldly promulgated a paradigm shift, which, as his student Herbert Schnadelbach was later to put it, involved, quote, the replacement of the critique of pure reason by the critique of linguistic reason. Now, the audacity of this move is hard, I think, to appreciate. Ever since the sophists challenged Plato, thinkers who focused on language were generally skeptical of the claims of reason. Against advocates of clear and distinct ideas in the mind, like, say, Descartes, Baroque thinkers developed a dazzling style that reveled in what a recent commentator has dubbed the principle of insufficient reason. In the Enlightenment, critics of Kant, like Hans-Georg Hamann, mobilized all the poetic resources of language to make it clear that ideas, however internal to the mind they might seem, were always dependent on the, as it were, semi-opaque medium of their expression. And when later critics of rationality, like Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, mounted their attacks on rationalist Hegelian metaphysics, they drew on the polysemic, rhetorically excessive potential of language to make their own points performatively. That is to say, their own language was, in a sense, deliberately difficult, opaque, polysemic, untransparent. In one form or another, the hermeneutics of Heidegger and Gadamer, the deconstruction of de Man and Derrida, Wittgenstein's ordinary language philosophy, just to name a few prominent examples, in one form or another, what came to be called the linguistic turn in 20th century philosophy further eroded faith in reason. Habermas, however, going against this tide, turned to language, understood in terms of what he called a universal pragmatics, which would take quite a while to unpack, which I'll talk a bit about later. He turned to language to bask, as it were, in the sunlight of a reason that emerged from its eclipse. Now, in any account of Habermas's growing dissatisfaction with Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse's concept of reason, one would have to turn to his early empirical study of the bourgeois public sphere, the structural transformation of the public sphere that came out in 1962. Although the book ends with a pessimistic account of the withering of a robust public sphere, reminiscent, in fact, of Marcuse's one-dimensional man, it begins by tracing the origins of a virtual space. The sphere, it's a kind of metaphor of spatiality, a space that existed between or among, we might say, the state, the economy, the family, in which individuals could meet, could leave behind, as it were, their origins elsewhere, and argue about their opinions on an equal footing without the assumption of superiority tied to ascribed roles or innate traits. Whether in salons, coffee houses, Masonic lodges, voluntary reading societies, or learned academies, the power of the better argument, based on logic and evidence, could produce, so at least this notion of the public sphere argued in an ideal typical sense, could produce a consensus through persuasion rather than seduction or coercion. Because of its critical potential, its impulse to reflect on rather than merely obey tradition, authority, and revelation, it paradoxically often had to be conducted in secret to avoid persecution. That was true, but its inherent logic was to become more transparent, to become available for public scrutiny, thus realizing the concept of publicity in the idea of the public. And ultimately would have an impact, this public sphere, on the political realm as well. Habermas summarized the benign intent of a discursive will formation, he puts the sentence in italics, that was not based on the arbitrary decision of the sovereign in the following way. Public debate was supposed to transform voluntas, will, into a ratio, reason, that in the public competition of private arguments came into being as the consensus about what was practically necessary in the interest of all. So this is the ideal. And obviously it's counterfactual, obviously it's not always realized, but the telos, we might say, of the public sphere is turning will into reason. Reason understood as argumentation about the better argument, and then a consensus as the telos of that. Well, here we have a version of the Enlightenment that seemed to escape the dialectic of domination and mastery, self-preservation, and self-sacrifice described as such despair by Horkheimer and Adorno in Dialektik der Aufklärung. Here, subjects were not primarily looking at objects in order to dominate and manipulate them, or treating other subjects as if they were objects, but rather addressing other subjects as their equal. Here, concepts were not vehicles for the suppression of non-identity and difference, as they were in Dialectic of Enlightenment. The disease of reason, we might say, had not affected all organs of the animal rationale. If there were an aesthetic dimension to this process, and remember that was the crucial thing that we've seen in Adorno, it was, Pace Adorno, not so much expressed in the work of art itself as in the public judgment of such works conducted without conformity to pre-given rules or standards. And one could trace this back, of course, to Kant's third critique. Against Marcuse as well, Habermas did not fall back on a Hegelian notion of dialectical Vernunft, reason, as an antidote to the analytic Verstand, intellect or understanding, that was a handmaiden of technological instrumental rationality. Now, for a number of years, Habermas's tacit critique of the first generation on the issue of reason remained somewhat muted. For example, in the seminal essay of 1968 that was so important in launching his career, Technology and Science as Ideology, he followed their lead in resisting Max Weber's split between facts and values and principled abandonment of a substantive notion of reason. Likewise, in the so-called positivism debate between the followers of Karl Popper's so-called critical rationalism and critical theory, which roiled German sociology in the 1960s, Habermas was clearly on the side of Adorno, the other major figure in this debate, even in fact defending Hegel against Popper's caricatured version of him. In the collection he put together in 1963 called Theory and Practice, Habermas excoriated the positivist exclusion of normative questions and the cramped definition of reason, which left the way open to an arbitrary decisionism. So here he's, in a way, expressing solidarity with some of the early critical theory positions, but at the same time, he began to distance himself with the goal of entirely overcoming the human domination of the natural world, based on a new and more benign version of technology, something Marcuse in particular had hoped for, and also distinguished himself from the goal of de-differentiating various value spheres in culture, the idea that Weber somehow needed to be reversed in a kind of grand, let's say, Hegelian sublation. In fact, in that very essay of 1968, Habermas had already distinguished between two concepts of rationalization, concepts whose elaboration, we might say, would preoccupy him for the rest of his career. He writes, at the level of the subsystems of purposive rational action, scientific technological progress has already compelled the reorganization of social institutions and sectors and necessitates it on an even larger scale than heretofore. But this process of the development of the productive forces can be a potential for liberation if, and only if, it does not replace rationality on another level. Rationality at the level of the institutional framework can occur only in the medium, he says, of symbolic interaction itself, that is, through removing restrictions on communication. So here we have a two-tier model, two-track model of rationalization: purposive, technological, domination of nature, communicative, symbolic interaction on the level of social interaction rather than what later he would call system interaction. Unlike Horkheimer and Adorno, he did not excoriate instrumental rationality per se. So this is an argument that backs away from their wholesale attack. He saw it as inevitable in the realm of labor, in the realm of our intercourse with the world of nature, which had to be, in a sense, if not mastered, at least somehow kept under control. He did, however, worry about its colonization of that separate sphere of what he at that time called symbolic interaction. So it's not so much an attack on instrumental rationality to core, but on its metastasis, we might say. The hypertrophy of instrumental rationality threatened, in fact, to diminish alternative variants of rationality in the life world. But unlike, say, Marcuse, whose stubborn resistance to the one-dimensional positive mentality he applauded, he was not convinced that instinctual revolution, eros, remember, is one of the sources of the alternative, could provide a plausible antidote to its domination. So Marcuse has this hope that reason can be somehow married to gratification, happiness, eros, in a work, Eros and Civilization, that in a way Habermas ultimately rejected. Now, by the late 1970s, we're moving ahead rather rapidly, a far more potent threat to the rationalist tradition than mere positivism had emerged, a threat which, broadly speaking, came to be called post-structuralism or postmodernism. And Habermas took it very much to heart. Alarmed by its penetration of leftist culture in the wake of Marxism's decline, he hastily, perhaps too hastily, conflated it with the neoconservative critique of modernity derived from thinkers like Galen and Schmidt, which was feeding the Tendenzwende, or turn to the right, in German politics of that era. Derived in large measure from the counter-Enlightenment tradition that culminated in Nietzsche's restitution of the claims of mutos over logos, it seemed to signal the exhaustion of all previous varieties of rationalism. Now, the only criterion of value seemed to be aesthetic taste rather than rational argument. Habermas not only perceived it as a politically dangerous challenge to a viable critical theory, but also began to understand the implications of Horkheimer and Adorno's writings of the 40s, in particular Dialectic of Enlightenment, in terms of a covert affinity with the work of Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, and others in the competing camp. Habermas now concluded that they, Horkheimer and Adorno, quote, had found political institutions, all social institutions, and daily practices as well, completely void of all traces of reason. For them, reason had become utopian in the literal sense of the word. It had lost all its locations, and thus ushered in the whole problematic of negative dialectics, utopian, without a space, without a topos. So the idea here is clearly that we have to locate it somewhere, and that it can't simply be in a negative dialectics or in the work of art. It has to be somewhere more powerfully present in our lives. In the lectures that were published as The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity in 1985, Habermas spelled out more explicitly than ever before the dangers he saw in Horkheimer and Adorno's one-sided analysis of the crisis of reason. He focused with alarm on Horkheimer and Adorno's claim, quote, that from the very start, the process of enlightenment is the result of a drive to self-preservation that mutilates reason, because it lays claim to it only in the form of a purposive, rational mastery of nature and instinct, precisely as instrumental reason. And remember, Horkheimer in Eclipse of Reason had said that there was this germ from the very beginning that was the, in a way, deep problem, the pseudon protas, I'm probably getting the Latin wrong, of the whole tradition of reason. Reducing all science and technology to its positivist caricature, ignoring the healthy implications of the differentiation of value spheres noted by Weber, and abandoning their earlier nuanced appreciation of the achievements of bourgeois modernity, they had ended, so he bemoaned, by allowing ideology critique to undermine its own foundations. Their total self-referential ideology critique, Adorno warned, quote, is turned not only against the irrational functions of bourgeois ideals, but against the rational potential of bourgeois culture itself. And thus it reaches into the foundations of any ideology critique that proceeds imminently. As instrumental, reason assimilated itself to power and thereby relinquished its critical force, that is, the final disclosure of ideology critique applied to itself. So there's a kind of anxiety that instrumental rationality attacked becomes a critique of all reason, reduced, a la Foucault as well, to nothing but a struggle for power. And the result was a performative contradiction, critique drawing on a reason that was itself the object of the critique, with no way out. Adorno's negative dialectics, he writes, reads like a continuing explanation of why we have to circle about within this performative contradiction and indeed even remain there, end quote. Habermas did not want to remain there. Such a skepticism about reason in general dangerously, in fact, aligned Horkheimer and Adorno, so Habermas lamented, with other critics of subject-centered reason, such as Martin Heidegger. For Habermas, what Horkheimer, Adorno, and Heidegger, as well as the French post-structuralists all lacked, was an appreciation of another potential, we might say, location for reason, of what speech act theorists had called the illocutionary dimension of language, which moved its center of gravity away from the subject of enunciation and the object of reference to the intersubjective action intended pragmatically by every linguistic utterance. Instead of focusing, we might say, on the I, he, she, or it function of utterances, it stressed instead the I, thou, or I, you function. It was precisely to this neglected dimension of linguistic practice, and of course, people like Buber had not completely neglected it, but nonetheless, most philosophers had, which operated above the level of deep structures, and this is crucial. He's against the kind of structuralist linguistics, a la, say, Levi-Strauss or Saussure before him. It was precisely to this neglected level of utterance, the level of linguistic practice in terms of illocutionary interaction, that Habermas turned to flesh out the insights he had had in his earlier work on symbolically mediated interaction and on the public sphere. No less was at stake than a radical reformulation of the ground of critique and a version of reason that the first generation of critical theorists had not taken sufficiently into account. Now, to make his case, he drew on an astoundingly wide range of old and new sources, among them Humboldtian linguistics, Gadamerean hermeneutics, the pragmatism of Charles Sanders Peirce and George Herbert Mead, Karl Otto Appel's transcendental pragmatics, Weber's theory of the modern differentiation of value spheres, Stephen Toulmin's work on argumentation, the speech act theory of Austin and Searle. I mean, Habermas has an amazingly capacious mind, capable, and maybe it's a Rube Goldberg structure, but capable of yoking together many different sources. And out of this all, he fashioned a revived version of critical theory which sought to avoid the Scylla of historicist contextualism, everything relative to a particular moment, and the Charybdis of an ahistorical transcendentalism or naturalism. Now, Habermas's audacious attempt to restore the light of reason after its eclipse involved several salient departures from traditional notions of reason, including a number that continue to inform classical critical theory. And I want to, and this is a kind of crazy number to try to inflict on you, I want to outline 8 of them. First, what I want to call the desubstantialization of reason, which means jettisoning an emphatic idea of objective reason inherent in the world, either actually or potentially, along with an ontological faith in the principle of sufficient reason. The second I want to call the de-transcendentalization of reason, de-transcendentalization, which means refusing to ground it in the forms allegedly hardwired in the mind of a universal subject beyond shifting historical contexts and evolving natural languages. The third, and we've already foreshadowed this, linguistification of reason, which meant seeking in communicative interaction, or his universal pragmatics, its foundation, we might call it a foundation-less foundation, as a normative point for critical theory, but without positing a fully rational form of life as the telos of critique. He wants to step back from that. Fourth, and we've also in a way signaled this, the de-sublimation of reason, which meant concretely situating the institutions and practices of the social world, acknowledging rationalization, therefore, as perpetually incomplete, impure, not a fixed final state. Reason becomes, as it were, a process of rationalization. The next is extremely important. It's what might be called the pluralization of reason, which meant resisting its comprehensive integration into a singular meta-variant, reason with a capital R, while nonetheless holding out hope for productive and balanced interaction between or among all of them. A kind of negotiation which allows something that moves on a horizontal level rather than being subsumed under a single model. And as a corollary, pluralization implied the acceptance of instrumental rationality as a legitimate variant. That was one version of reason. Yes, it was okay in its place, while warning against the potential need under capitalism, the pathological inclination for it to colonize or marginalize alternatives. The sixth move he makes is what I've called the proceduralization of reason, which meant seeking discursive protocols of reasoning and argumentation that can be applied to both cognitive as well as normative questions, proceduralization. The seventh is the temporalization of reason as a future project, which means jettisoning a strongly anamnestic notion of reason, something that's recoverable from the past, in favor of one that sees it as a regulative ideal in the Kantian sense, something to be ever more closely approximated but never fully realized. And eighth and finally, and this is in a way related to that, what I would call the as-if narrativization of reason as a standard by which to measure the potential realization of that future. Although no emphatic philosophy of history in the strong sense could withstand the bitter lessons of the 20th century, which after all made a mockery of any naive notion of human progress, or the reason that was supposed to be, a la Hegel, realizing the world, a rational reconstruction of a species-wide learning process, and I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on the idea of a learning process, might be useful in orienting ourselves in the struggle to realize a more rational society in the future. All right, let me slow down a bit and look at these in turn. First, the desubstantialization of reason. While Adorno could still talk of solidarity with metaphysics to the moment of its fall, and Horkheimer nostalgically recalled the objective reason that prevailed prior to its eclipse, Habermas adopted a position that he could forthrightly call post-metaphysical. It's his own term. Above all, this meant abandoning the assumption that rationality might be an inherent quality of the world, either actually or potentially, the idea of, say, sufficient reason. Moving away from the Hegelian underpinnings of early critical theory, he rejected the idea that concepts could be understood ontologically as latent in a world that was not yet adequate to them on the level of actuality. So this is a major move away from a strong, let's call it Hegelian notion of reason. Second, the detranscendentalization. Reason could not be located, he argued, in a universal, species-wide, timeless mental capacity in the sense of, say, Kant's a priori epistemological categories. Even more than his Frankfurt School predecessors, Habermas sought to make a clean break with the consciousness philosophy, sometimes called mentalism, that understood reason as inherent in the mind of the thinking subject and or congruent with the external world represented in that mind. And I think of the thinking subject here either as the individual or as a transcendental subject, universal. Reason understood logocentrically, based on the privileging of concepts and representations of the world as objects for cognitive purposes alone, this was actually an impoverished version of it and not equivalent to reason per se. Whereas it only adopted the perspective of the first or third persons, the dualism of subject and object, I and it neglected that second-person relationship of reciprocity between subjects who recognized each other as such, who communicated with each other. Subject-centered rationality was indeed a function of that drive for self-preservation that Horkheimer, we remember, had seen as leading to the domination of what was construed as external to it. Rather than a faculty of the individual mind representing an object external to it, reason should be understood more capaciously as an intersubjective procedure of validity testing. So reason is reduced, or in a way located in the reciprocal process of reasoning. Another implication of detranscendentalization was the replacement of a Kantian notion of the necessary character of the presuppositions inherent in all attempts to communicate with Wittgensteinian ones. There's a lot of Wittgenstein in Habermas. That is, he explained, it does not have the transcendental meaning of a universal, necessary, noumenal, intelligible condition of possible experience, but has the grammatical meaning, this is the Wittgenstein speaking, of an unavoidability, stemming from the conceptual connections of a system of learned, but for us inescapable rule-governed behavior. So there is something that compels us, but it's not transcendental in the strong sense of being in minds. It happens when we use language, when we use grammar, when we communicate, something that's governed by rules, something that we learn. And this leads to the third move that he makes, linguistification of reason. De-Transcendentalization, he wrote, quote, leads on the one hand to the embedding of knowing subjects into the socializing context of a life world. So it's clear that it's not above that life world. That on the one hand, and on the other to the entwinement of cognition with speech and action. It was in the interpersonal communicative function of language, which Habermas fully acknowledged was not the only way language might be approached. I mean, he doesn't say this is all of language, that a non-mentalist rationality might be located. The action part is, you think of John Searle, it's speech acts, not simply talking about the world, but acting through speech, the illocutionary dimensions of promising or asserting or whatever is happening as you speak to another person rather than just describing the world. Whether implicitly or not, all speech acts entail giving reasons and making arguments to support their claims for validity, although some do so more expressly, more explicitly, more self-consciously than others. This is true when there is an explicit disagreement, a problem to be solved. Then tacit assumptions need to be reflexively or discursively validated. We then begin to sort of step back and argue. They enter what the American philosopher Wilfrid Sellers called the space of reasons. It's not everything, it's not all the space that we can think of, but it is a space in which we reason, we argue, we give reasons for our actions, we try to persuade. We're into subjective arguments among interlocutors, normative claims to rightness, and inferential reasoning subtend any claims about the state of reality. Not only was there an imperative to argue for a position rather than merely assert it, but also an equal one to listen to the arguments of others, which might persuade you by their evidentiary, logical, or rhetorical power. Even those beliefs that had once been unquestionably accepted as sacred commandments or whatever could become available for validity testing by those who held them. In fact, if there's any one criterion to identify modernity, it would be the increased accessibility of what was previously held sacred, held by basic authority, to the test of argumentative justification. What he called post-conventional societies, no longer bound together by unquestioned traditional cultural assumptions, needed to justify their decisions discursively if they were to avoid arbitrary violence. Although there was never a universal meta-language, which might be seen as the basis for all natural languages, or as its potential telos, there was in every language, a latent imperative at the deepest level to supply reasons for whatever assertions, beliefs, commands, etc. might be uttered by speakers to their listeners. Modernity, if it means anything at all, implies increasing recourse to that imperative in making actual decisions. Now, I don't have really time to go into this, but the same argument holds for normative as well as cognitive arguments. Now, an explicit target of Habermas' critique in all of this was the so-called praxis philosophy, that a continued Marxist search for a concrete meta-subject of history, a collective agent which would consciously and rationally make the world and know what it had made, a materialist version of Vico's famous verum factum principle. The image of man as Homo faber, whose productive labor was the principal source of the world around him, was no longer viable. Though the material conditions of the life world remain central to any social analysis, quote, the critical theory of society must no longer rely on the normative contents of the expressivist model of alienation and reappropriation of essential powers. So what he's doing here is attacking Lukács, attacking a whole tradition of Western Marxism, which still looked for the agent, the meta-subject, the maker of history, expressively manifesting itself in the totality. Here, the meta-narrative of a singular reason that alienated itself from the apparent contingencies of history and then recognized them as its own manifestations in a grand affirmative reconciliation, well, this could no longer be counted on to heal the wounds of deremption. Reason could not be understood in terms of a narcissistic mirroring that underlay an identity philosophy of the kind that Adorno, of course, had so powerfully criticized in negative dialectics. The fourth move is the de-sublimation of reason, de-sublimation. Along with the detranscendentalization of reason went its embeddedness in the historical realities of the world. It's not up here, it's down here. Although in many respects he admired Kant, with whose limits on reason he sympathized, Habermas was closer here to Hegel in rejecting any attempt to posit a transcendental subject outside of the actual historical constitution of concrete subjects who were doing the arguing in concrete circumstances which always impeded the perfect leveling of the playing field and symmetry of participation. If there is a tension between what is and what should be, and he wants to maintain that tension, he's not a positivist, it's not an affirmation of what is, it has to be located within various forms of life, within specific social practices, within concrete institutions, not beyond them. The theory of communicative action, he writes, integrates the transcendental tension between the intelligible and the world of appearances in communicative everyday praxis, yet does not thereby level it out. This is a major argument, that there is still this tension. He doesn't go all the way with someone like Appel towards stressing transcendental, wants to leave it within this actual world in which we live. Communicative rationality could thus itself, interestingly, be called the other of the dominant tradition of reason, whether understood subjectively or objectively, but one that was not outside of reason, more capaciously construed. Unlike the vital forces of the body, or madness, or the imagination, or the senses, which you remember had been allegedly repressed by a coercive exclusivist reason, and once unleashed practiced liberation, this for some people like, say, Foucault, this other was able to avoid a romantic celebration of allegedly rapturous limit experiences and the defiantly irrational. Pace Adorno, it was not restricted to the enclave of the aesthetic, where it kept the faith with a primal mimetic experience prior to reason itself. Rather than understanding mimesis as an external supplement to the rational moment in art, Habermas contended that mimesis itself was internal to rationality, when it was discursively rather than monologically understood. That is, insofar as communicative rationality involved a dialogic exchange rather than a conceptual subsumption, it did not efface non-identity in the service of a single rational truth. Axel Honneth was to spell out the implications of that in great detail. I'd be happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. In other words, the non-dominating logic of mimesis, which involves, you remember, the imitation of the other by the self, can be discerned in a communicative rationality, which functions as much through, as we've said, listening to and learning from the arguments of others, as trying to persuade them of the validity of your own. So it's not imposing as much as it is a give and take. And as a result, communicative reason did not serve, as had some of its more restricted variants, to enforce rigid boundaries in order to fend off pollution by what it had abjected. In fact, rather than itself dismissing these others as utterly heterogeneous to reason, inhabiting a realm that could be damned as irrational, communicative rationality could include them in the discursive process itself, at least as producing alternative content worth arguing about. And he uses Benjamin as a very important resource for this insight. In principle, there was nothing that could not be included in the process of discursive reasoning. All right, the fifth move is the pluralization of reason. And this is a little more complicated, perhaps, even than the ones I'm describing. For unlike the comprehensive type of reason that, say, Marcuse or Horkheimer in the more Hegelian moods had upheld, this new paradigm of reason could not lay claim to a totalizing sublation of all differences, including those dividing various types of reason themselves. The pluralization of reason, in fact, was not a flaw to be overcome, not a symptom of the fragmentation of something that once was whole and had to be made whole again. It must be made clear, Habermas insisted, it must be made clear that the purism of pure reason is not resurrected in communicative reason. Impure reason, instead, meant the imperative to give reasons in an unending quest for a general consensus that would remain forever counterfactual. We never get there where we all agree. It's not the attainment of a single perfectly consistent state of full rationality. In fact, paradoxically, if one ever were to achieve that ideal of perfect rationality, it would really be undermining the very foundation of communicative reason, which entails the ongoing, never-ending reasoning among finite, fallible, different, and we might say, identical human beings with all of their corporeal and historical differences. So reasoning doesn't efface difference in a kind of consensus that yokes everybody together in a kind of general will a la Rousseau. There was, moreover, no overarching way to integrate and reconcile what modernity had differentiated. Philosophy, Habermas stresses, must operate under conditions of rationality that it is not chosen. As Kant and Weber had known, distinct value spheres had developed their own relative autonomy, following a unique logic and institutional development. Now, they were not watertight, not unconnected from the less differentiated life world out of which they emerged, they could not be entirely reintegrated into it. Because there was no overarching meta-concept of reason, a superior, healthy version that would allow us to stigmatize others as diseased or pathological, to come back to Horkheimer's vocabulary, there was, Pace the older Frankfurt School, even a legitimate place, as we've seen, for an objectifying relationship to the world and to the self, alongside a more intersubjective or hermeneutic one. There was, to use a term he was to get from Luhmann, need for system as well as social integration of the life world. And however much Horkheimer bemoaned the formalization of reason as a symptom of its disease, there was also a place for formalism in, say, modern legal systems that could not be folded into a higher level of substantive justice. Habermas pointedly remarks, and I quote him, "It never occurred to Horkheimer that there might be a difference between instrumental and formal reason. Moreover, he unceremoniously assimilated procedural reason, which no longer makes the validity of its results dependent on the rational organization of the world, but on the rationality of the procedures through which it solves its problems, to instrumental reason." He unceremoniously, Horkheimer did, assimilated one to the other. And in fact, to come to our sixth moment in this long list, in one sense, the formal dimension of reason, its following certain procedural rules, was essential from the very beginning. For it can be found in the communicative nature of language itself. Against the structural formalism that disparaged the pragmatic level of usage in favor of deep structures, Habermas insisted, quote, that not only language, but speech too, that is, the employment of sentences in utterances, is accessible to formal analysis. Now, formal here, it should be understood, formal does not mean what traditional Aristotelian logic had identified with the syllogistic forms of sentences, but rather the procedures of rational argumentation, where contradictions were performative rather than semantic. Now, what we might ask was the procedure in question. Locating its initial institutional embodiment in 17th century science and 18th century legal and constitutional practices, Habermas identifies it with the idea of discourse. So discourse, we might say, is a more formal way of communicatively testing the validity of arguments. And he defines it, and bear with me for a moment, in the following way. Discourse is that form of communication that is removed from contexts of experience and action, and its structure assures us that the bracketed validity claims of assertions, recommendations, or warnings are the exclusive object of discussion. The participants, themes, and contributions are not restricted except with reference to the goal of testing the validity claims in question, that no force except that of the better argument is exercised, and that as a result, all motives except that of the cooperative search for truth are excluded. Now, this is clearly ideal-typical, but nonetheless it's a standard by which discourse can be separated from other types of interaction, strategic or coercive or whatever. For Habermas, the radical opposition between substantive and formal reason, borrowed from Weber, was itself, and this is his phrase, a false alternative. based on the premise that, quote, the disenchantment of religious metaphysical worldviews robs rationality, along with the contents of tradition, of all substantive connotations, and thereby strips it of its power, end quote. From the very beginning, one of the distinguishing marks of any rational as opposed to magical or mythical way of thinking had been precisely the ability to discriminate differences rather than confuse categories and merge everything into a kind of turgid whole. Modernity meant an acceleration of this process. Kant's three critiques, Habermas wrote, were a reaction to the emerging independence of distinct complexes of rationality. Since the 18th century, the forms of argumentation specializing in objectivating knowledge, moral practical insights, and aesthetic judgments have diverged from one another. Did this mean that there was simply no claim to universality? Well, although respecting the more intransigent universalism of his colleague Karl Otto Appel, Habermas sought a way to retain the critical power of transcendental universal norms, but within the diverse practices of everyday life. And this is crucial, because as early as his 1973 postscript to Knowledge and Human Interests, he had drawn on Peirce's consensus theory of truth to argue, quote, that the unity of argumentative reasoning is compatible with this differential meaning, constitution of object domains. In all sciences, all of them, argumentation is subject to the same conditions of the discursive redemption of truth claims. So yes, we argue about different things, but when we argue, we basically are using discursive means that are pretty much the same. In an essay of 1982 entitled The Unity of Reason, Diversity of Its Voices, he conceded a great deal to the anti-foundationalist critics of an emphatic concept of substantive reason. People like Rorty and Lyotard. He agreed that reason can't be disembedded from its contingent historical embodiments. He admitted that if there is a unified rationality, it exists only in those diverse manifestations which resist subsumption under a single comprehensive model. So you see how much this philosophy is a philosophy that basically is moving against subsumptive models of general principles and then cases of general algorithms and then instances that are simply just versions of that larger principle. But it's what Kant would have called a regulative ideal with normative force, an idea of reason rather than rational knowledge. It's impossible to abandon universality entirely. In his vivid metaphor, communicative rationality is, quote, a rocking hull, but it does not go under in the sea of contingencies, even if shuddering in high seas is the only mode in which it copes with these contingencies. Drawing on the response of the American philosopher Hilary Putnam to Richard Rorty's radical ethnocentric contextualism, and also using Gadamer's ideal of harmoniously fusing horizons, Habermas argued that it was wrong simply to equate unity with the coercive repression of difference and particularity, as some post-structuralists were wont to do. Truth claims may emerge from within specific contexts, but transcend their putative boundaries. Rather than hovering above specific subvariants, a genuine rational universality can only be built in the negotiations between and among them. To a frankly proceduralist version, what he called a weak but not defeatist concept of linguistically embodied reason, it would be possible to avoid having to choose between Kant's ahistorical transcendentalism, which is rehearsed in a way in the work of Appel, and Hegel's theological historical holism, which in the hands of Rorty became simply contextualism without any universal potential. As a result, it allows us to abandon any illusions of ever reaching a final utopian state of full rationality, in which the world and reason are completely reconciled. If there is a possible unity of reason, it's not to be achieved on the level of the differentiated cultural spheres, but rather in the more primordial, quote, communicative practice of everyday life, in which cognitive explanations, moral expectations, expressions, and evaluations interpenetrate this unity, interpenetrate. And this unity is in a certain way always already established. The need for reconciliation, which Hegel registered against Kant, springs from one-sided rationalizations of this everyday practice. In other words, there was for Habermas still a residue of at least an interaction among the various modalities of reason in a pre-differentiated life world, and increasingly had been eviscerated by the development of distinct value spheres. All right, then let's moving towards the end now, to the temporalization of reason. Although always already latent in communicative interaction in that pre-reflective life world, in the way I mentioned a moment ago, the actualization of a fully achieved discursive rationality in institutional terms as a form of life, something like the public sphere writ large, realizing the dream of democratic politics, well, this is inherently counterfactual. As in his defense of the uncompleted project of modernity. And this was, as many of you know, the title of his 1980 Adorno Prize address. Habermas was not calling for a fully rational or completely modern society. It's not as if he's saying, well, it's uncompleted, let's complete it, but rather an unending process of reasoning communicatively about the issues of the day. Nothing makes me more nervous, he insisted, than the imputation, repeated in a number of different versions and in most peculiar contexts, that because the theory of communicative action focuses attention on the social facticity of recognized validity claims, it proposes, or at least suggests, a rationalistic utopian society, end quote. Modernity, in other words, was not merely uncompleted, it was by definition uncompletable, in the sense that total rationality was a never attainable goal, but served instead as a regulative ideal in Kant's sense. Reason then implies a humble humanism that's not equivalent to the self-assertion of a species-wide rational subject seeking to overcome or reintegrate the alienated otherness of nature or different cultures. It's a humanism that also does not posit a sovereign subject, remember the critique of praxis philosophy, at the origin or even the conclusion of the process, a subject who could even make a decision to follow rational procedures or not, for such a subject would be situated in an impossible place outside of or prior to the community of rationality, entailed by all symbolic interaction itself, and as such would not really be fully human. But however modest, it was still a humanist rationalism that avoids the reverse error of a negative metaphysics, one that evokes a reality beyond discursive argumentation, in which the world is entirely negated as pure, irrational contingency, and the only antidote to meaninglessness is the return of mythic belief. That disenchantment of the world that Weber had correctly seen as a handmaiden of its rationalization did not mean either relativist nihilism or the authoritarian assertion of ungrounded belief as its desperate antidotes. And these are really two sides of the same coin. But the final move he makes, and this is one of the ones I think it's most unique to him, is the as-if narrativization of reason. The as-if narrativization. While rejecting an emphatic philosophy of history, one that says this is the way the world works through time, Habermas did not, however, entirely abandon the idea that positing an evolutionary model of rationalization with cross-cultural validity, a hypothetical narrative of species-wide development, a kind of thought experiment, might have its practical uses. Now, this is something that Kant himself had famously suggested in his 1784 essay, Idea of Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Point of View. In that piece, Kant had imbued nature with a teleological purpose, the historical realization of practical, let us say, moral reason. A purpose that would seem to be grounded in rather too metaphysical a premise for Habermas. But rather than positing that teleology in the world of empirical facts, known cognitively through synthetic a priori judgments, which would consequently restrict human freedom, Kant had been very careful to call it only an idea, in the sense of being thinkable but not knowable, very much like the imperatives of practical reason itself. And this is a distinction that students of Kant will recognize between knowing something through synthetic a priori judgment and being able to think something like the existence of the soul, the existence of God. I can't know it, but I can think it. Any philosophical attempt to write such a history was therefore not to be confused with an account of the disparate facts of history, as it unfolded in reality, or might do so in the future, facts that could not be understood providentially as effects of a latent superindividual subject of history making itself manifest in them, as it would be, say, for Hegel. Instead, it was an as-if fiction. In fact, Kant even compares it to a novel. He even uses that term. The fiction that must be, quote, considered possible and even helpful to this intention of nature. So it has a practical implication. Now, Habermas's version of this non-cognitive narrative was what he called a rational reconstruction, which would give us a heuristic device to make sense of the process of rationalization in all of its forms, without, however, either confusing the model with empirical reality, he's not saying it's really happening, or seeing it as a substantive force in history understood as a causal law. Replacing a no longer adequate historical materialist scheme of successive modes of production, it would provide an always revisable, and, God knows you need to revise these things, standard, a normative standard against which actual historical change would occur without serving as a prophecy of where it would necessarily go. It was more of a hypothetical thought experiment than, say, Marxist historical materialism had been, positing rather intuitively the existence of a pre-theoretical and pre-reflective learning process with potential universal scope, but always dependent on a posteriori empirical and discursive validation on the part of those who participate in the process. I mean, after all, the 20th century is not a place in which one can think you can't unlearn the Enlightenment. At best, it rested only in what Habermas called a weak naturalism, in which human learning can be understood in a way as continuous with the biological processes that were described by Darwin. He writes, the fundamental mechanism for social evolution in general is to be found in an automatic inability not to learn. Inability not to learn. Not learning, but not learning is the phenomenon that calls for explanation at the socio-cultural state of development. So it's very hard to figure out why we don't learn. Therein lies, if you will, the rationality of man. Only against this background does the overpowering irrationality of the history of the species become visible. Taking his cue from sociologists like Durkheim and Luhmann, psychologists like Piaget and Kohlberg, linguists like Chomsky, Habermas sought to locate the latent developmental competences that existed for communicative rationality and moral maturation, which were then capable of being realized, but were not necessarily going to be realized, both on the individual and social level. This is not a macro process happening to a generic subject, he made clear. Bearers of evolution are society itself and also the subjects of action integrated in it, once again, de-sublimating it in this world. Evolution can be deciphered from a rationally reconstructible pattern of hierarchy of ever more comprehensive structures. If we separate those structures from the events with which the empirical substrata change, we need not assume univocity, nor continuity, nor necessity, nor irreversibility of the course of history, end quote. Although the potential to evolve was there in a developmental logic that revealed itself retroactively, this is a rational reconstruction, the actual achievement of each stage was itself dependent on contingent historical factors and the ways in which crises were resolved and problems overcome. And these had to be tested empirically. Some problems may appear to be solved, but it's always possible to regress to an earlier stage of development, as the emergence of 20th century totalitarian politics so clearly demonstrated. At its most fundamental, Habermas employed rational reconstruction to arrive at the very principles of universal pragmatics themselves. An inborn, species-wide communicative competence, a variant of Chomsky's theory of linguistic competence in grammatical terms, develops over time into the discursive skills that allow participants in discussions to proffer and weigh the better argument and reach an agreement based on reflection and persuasion. So we have this potential to be this competent communicatively, not always activated institutionally, perhaps as well as personally. Individual communicative competence is intertwined with intersubjective mutual practices, which can produce a more sustained institutional setting for enhanced rational communication and sustained practices of discursive deliberation. We might say that non-reflexive, naive learning without discursive validation can be then succeeded by reflexive learning. So yes, we're always learning, but now we can think about it, we can argue, we can validate through the better argument. Against the idealist hope for totalized integration, his evolutionary model valorized differentiation. Against the privileging of one variant, such as Luhmann's elevation of systems rationality, he argued for honoring the distinct varieties that had emerged out of the practices of the world. So this is a multiple evolutionary pattern. Thus, the evolution of moral, or in Kant's sense, practical reason, would follow its own course. For Habermas, quote, morality refers to practical questions which can be decided with reasons, conflicts of action which can be resolved through consensus. Only those questions are moral in the strict sense which can be answered in a meaningful way from the Kantian standpoint of universalization, what all could wish for. Now, the somewhat thin procedural notion of morality was different from substantive ethics, which emerged out of concrete forms of life and might well resist being turned into a universal binding norm. I mean, it makes a big difference between morality, which has this thin universality within it, and concrete ethical forms of life, which are not incommensurable, but at least singular and different. The crucial point in all this is that moral intuitions could then be discursively redeemed through communicative interaction rather than simply blindly obeyed as they were in traditional or charismatically legitimated cultures. So even an ethos in which you're embedded, well, you can argue about it. Once your world view is decentered, you can talk to people from different cultures, learn from that interaction. Such interaction involved the ability to exchange roles and understand the point of view of the other involved in the subjective validation of moral judgments, that medic moment, we might say, where I imitate the other, I surrender myself to the other, I give myself to the other, I humble myself in a way, listening rather than telling the other what I think. Rather than willing without contradiction what could be universal laws, the categorical imperative, a defined moral obligation, it meant willing what could be agreed upon by the participants in the discussion. Building on the ontogenetic models of Piaget and Kohlberg, Habermas rationally reconstructed, this is this as-if narrativization, an intersubjective social progression from pre-conventional through conventional to post-conventional levels of moral reasoning, culminating in universal, comprehensive, and consistent principles like the golden rule or the categorical imperative. Understood heuristically as a cumulative learning process, but always subject to regression, they could come to inform cultural and legal institutions, and he spends a lot of time in some of his later works talking about legality, which transmitted them to posterity and made them available for unending rational discussion. So as a species, we do in fact learn. And I have a long argument here about aesthetic rationalization as well, which I will spare you, but he also argues that there too, there is a potential to talk about reason. So not just cognitive and moral, but also in the aesthetic sphere. Because rational reconstruction means that reasoning can be employed with hindsight to posit the innate potential for its own development. Now, it may seem, because of that, to court the charge of circularity. It was, however, and I'm pretty close to finishing here now, it was, however, Habermas's argument following Hans Blumenberg, who, of course, analyzes the legitimacy of the modern age, that modernity, and along with it modern reason, had to, quote, create its normativity out of itself. Whereas ancient notions of reason, let's say the Platonic, maybe the Aristotelian, were grounded outside of themselves, as, for example, in intelligible forms put into the world by God, modern ones were without external foundations. So that image of the rocking hull on the ocean, a very nice one, without a firm ground. Doesn't go under, there are storms, it's always rocking, but nonetheless it stays afloat. For all his willingness to engage in a respectful dialogue with religious traditions, and in fact, as you know, he even had a productive exchange with Pope Benedict XVI, Habermas had no doubts that secularization paved the way for the self-grounding of reason. Now, in a way, Habermas's theory, therefore, was an updated version of Kant, because Kant, remember, had written a critique of pure reason, in which reason was both the object of the critique and the tool through which critique was itself conducted. The genitive of is very important. A critique of pure reason, by pure reason, of pure reason. Ever since his doctoral dissertation on Schelling, Habermas, in fact, been skeptical of attempts to posit ultimate foundations, whether natural philosophy, transcendental idealism, or identity philosophy. And as a result, the reconstruction he attempted was both of a model of evolutionary development towards greater rationality, which might be observed from an imagined position outside it, and that's in a way going to the I-it position, and a discursive process of arguing rationally about the applicability of that very model. It includes both, and as such, we might say, combines a moment of consciousness-centered subjective reason with another based on intersubjective communicative rationality. As in the case of his interpretation of psychoanalysis as a model of an emancipatory science, although without the dubious parallel between psychological, individual, and social meta-subject, it involved a mixture of third-person observation with second-person recognition and interaction. To maximize the potential for a robust rationalism in a post-metaphysical era, the interaction of its diverse voices had to be fostered, even as there was no chance of their fully harmonizing into a single unified song. Although, to adopt one of his key oppositions, social integration based on intersubjective communication could regain some of the ground it had lost in modernity to system integration based on impersonal functionalist processes, it would be a vain hope to wish for the full incorporation of the latter into the former. The best that one could hope for, therefore, was a restoration of the balance, a kind of negotiation among different versions of rationality, something that had been lost when modernity privileged purpose of rationality, privileged system integration, privileged steering mechanisms like money and administration over community rationality, social integration, and the participatory involvement of the life world. Well, all right, this is my very hurried, and I'm sure for many of you rather sketchy overview of Habermas's position. As might be imagined, the system as bold and ambitious as this. I mean, this is, as I said, a little bit like a Rube Goldberg system and lots of things plugged in. Has engendered an enormous critical response, which touches on each and every aspect of his argument. And it's to some of these criticisms, not all, that we will turn in the final lecture of the series, trying to make sense of what Habermas' position ultimately adds up to, or at least now the status of it in the debate concerning the attempt to restore reason after its eclipse. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Marty, for this wonderful presentation and the discussion of the philosophical development of Jürgen Habermas. I'm just a master of ceremonies here, and insofar I will not get myself too much involved in the discussion, but I would like to open the discussion for 15, 20 minutes with a somehow provocative question concerning, let's say, I'm not doubting the universality of Habermas' thinking. My question might sound the question of, let's say, of a historian of event, the history of events, and my possibly social history concerning the, let's say, the milieu of Jürgen Habermas. In the sense, and so far I would like to somehow, to be somehow provocative in my question, and relying to your first lecture concerning the old Frankfurt School, which represent in my eyes, the crisis and catastrophe. Doesn't Habermas, his specific background as a thinker of the Federal Republic, isn't he thinking, I would put it like that, isn't he thinking in motions, in notions, in norms and forms of normalcy and continuity? And he, detests, I would put it like that, he detests, let's say, the state of exception as a point of departure in order to think politically as a philosopher. And somebody, and that might be the peak of the provocative question, I don't remember exactly who, I think it was Malachi Cohen who once said, Jürgen Habermas was Adenauer's philosopher.
Until you got to that last sentence, Adenauer, I think, brought more, let's say, pragmatic economic issues to the fore, and was involved in a Cold War that Habermas would not have felt comfortable buying into. But that aside, I agree. Habermas, I think, would be the first to say that we begin somewhere. We begin in a context. We begin with our own life experiences. We begin with our own horizons, that we're not hovering above the world. And his own horizon is precisely that of a figure who, and we can even talk in very micro-generational terms, emerges at a certain point in the history of the Federal Republic in relation to the Nazi era, in which he recognizes the rupture that existed in the past and the necessity of starting anew, and yet also the possibility of continuities with early traditions that seemingly have been utterly, in a way, discredited, so that there is a kind of, let's go back to the Enlightenment rather than assume it's completely problematic. But also a sense of the, let's say, fragility of what had been achieved in the recovery after World War II, but also in the value of nurturing precisely the good dimensions of that achievement. So the Germany that he, in a way, matured into after the war is a Germany that, with unexpected success, when you think about it, was able to transform itself more or less successfully into a viable liberal democratic country with, capitalist and other problems that one might feel undermines the significance of that. But nonetheless, this is something that in 1945, if you said, would this likely to be the case? Not everybody would be so sure. So it's a legal system that operates fairly well. It's a system that maintains most of the human rights that we assume to be part of the tradition of Enlightenment, broadly speaking. And therefore, as a German, he felt and feels, I think still, a kind of identification with those achievements, which ought not to be so quickly dismissed. One of the critics, Vincent Descartes, the French philosopher, says, well, look, this is all from the point of view of Germans who were worried about irrationality, who didn't like Nietzsche because it led to Nazism. We French, well, we have the great traditions of Descartes, and we know about reason, and we see reason, a la Foucault, as always complicit with power, because we realize that irrationalism may not always be so evil. Now, this is one sort of overly reductive notion. Habermas, just the German, we French are more, at ease. I think Habermas's point about being situated, however, and this is one that I think is worth taking seriously, is that no matter how local, parochial, and we might say restricted you are, you also have the capacity, coming out of that context, to negotiate with, translate into the idiom of the other, be in some ways in dialogue through a non, let's say, ethnocentric version of the values you hold with people who have different values. You can listen to them. So Habermas himself is I've always thought, performatively consistent in his willingness to listen to interlocutors, to learn from the people he argues with, to take from other traditions, from American, Anglo-American philosophy, some of the Frankfurt School, of course, its first generation did not take from, even listen to some French thinkers. So by the end of his life, Jacques Derrida and Jürgen Habermas were having a civil discussion. They began as seemingly, opposites, but moved at least towards reasoning about stuff together. So this may be overly utopian, but there is, I think, a moment of truth in that capacity, both to know you're located, know you're parochial, and yet somehow have the capacity to speak beyond. So here we are, talking in English in a country where Hebrew is the language of the population, about a German thinker whose ideas, I've discussed in many other contexts around the world. So there is the capacity, in other words, to move beyond that moment. But you're right, in various biographies, Martin Tuksix or Matthew Speck and others have tried to situate Habermas in those specific contexts. And I think any good intellectual historian would insist on doing precisely that.
Questions and comments are welcome, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
In a way, the notion of discursive process, which you should describe in Habermas, reminds one of what used to be popular, I think, in the 90s in the United States, deliberative democracy.
Yeah.
This kind of thing, which there's some of the literature, which was about having a discussion, which normal people sit and discuss, and presumably something comes out of this in the way of a kind of a rational process. But of course, that's not what comes out of it in the end, because we know that one of the problems of modern democracy is that there is no common good. And there is nothing in Habermas, as far as I understand, which talks about the common good. If you have a discussion and you don't have a clear, consensual notion of what is the common good of society, then what you get in the end is a kind of a discussion which degenerates into opposite interests expressing themselves with arguments, and sometimes very good arguments, rational arguments, or expressions of identity. That is to say, I choose this because I identify with it. But of course, there is no common good in the modern world. You remember the argument that Alistair McIntyre made, which was that there's no point in arguing because we don't have a common basis within which to argue. So McIntyre's reaction was we should go back to some kind of a pre-modern, either religious or Greek, which becomes a reactionary form of discussion. But it is a problem that we can't really have this notion of rational argument which leads to a common good because we don't have a notion of a common good. But that is the very basis of our democratic situation. That is to say, if we had a common good, it would probably be imposed by someone. We wouldn't have a consensual one. So the question which then arises in the case of Habermas is, where does this lead to? Do we get any kind of what does it mean to have this kind of rational discussion? I think it just leads to the kind of thing that we do have, which is, some people don't really argue or don't really make a case for one thing or another, but nevertheless, there is a kind of, if you watch the elections either in the United States or even here, God forbid, you notice there is a kind of an argument going on, but of course we don't have a common. So we get identity politics or we get interest politics.
Well, it's certainly true that the Habermasian notion of deliberative democracy at its most ideal, based on an argumentative process that includes everybody who has a relevant position, giving everybody an opportunity to participate, listening to the better argument, and then coming to a rationally achieved consensus is clearly a counterfactual ideal that will never be achieved, and he knows that. So the Schmittian argument that no, it's always foe versus friend, it's always basically who has legitimacy rather than who has the argument, is one that he's heard many, many times. I would say that there are, broadly speaking, three alternatives. One is the alternative that you, in a way, identify with McIntyre, that there are fixed positions that you are born into or thrown into or socialized into a position. You have it for the rest of your life, that's it. You have no ability to convert religiously, no ability to convert politically. You are who you are, your identity is fixed. Very rigid notion of tradition, that somehow tradition is a trap, prison, can't ever challenge it. The second is, which seems to me, in a way, both, I suppose, persuasive on one level. I mean, I can't suddenly, unlearn my language or never vote for Republican. I mean, there are various things, defines who I am. But on the other hand, it also is, I think, deeply problematic in a world that is a world of cultural interpenetration and diasporic loss of traditional rootedness. And we live in a world in which no one belongs to a single community. We're all constituted by many different communal identities. So there are no single traditions. We have lots of traditions from which we can then pick or choose. We're not forced to accept one or the other. We somehow can choose among them. The second alternative, and this is one that other people have argued for, is the position of compromise. So there are interests. You want this, I want that, I can be helpful. I won't agree with you. I'll bargain. I'll bargain. So compromise is part of democracy. Now, Habermas, in certain of his moves, more idealistic moves, certainly in his career, was very negatively inclined towards compromise. He saw it as a lesser strategic use of language. And people like Thomas McCarthy and others pushed him to say, look, under certain circumstances, democracy necessitates compromise. That the fiscal cliff we're about to go over in the United States will be avoided if the Republicans and Democrats come up with something that will allow them to go beyond their principles. The third position, the Habermas position, is look, in the modern world, there are moments when people's positions can be changed, when people's interests or values, the idea of the good, or whatever you want to say as a substantive thing, can in fact be molded by discussion rather than simply be a fixed, let's say, given before a discussion. I mean, this goes back to, it's a very Hegelian idea, it goes back to the issue of whether or not desires are prior to their rational discussion, or whether desires can be rationally, in some ways, motivated or rationally at least inflected. Now, it's true that some desires, I may have made this analogy before in the earlier Q&A, I mean, chocolate, vanilla ice cream, this is something, I like chocolate, you like vanilla, I'm not going to dissuade you. I'm not going to be able to make an argument that chocolate's better than vanilla. But it is possible that I could say, well, socialism is a better system with more equality, no, fascism is better. So we may, sorry. So we may, I just picked that. So we may have, and you may persuade me that fascism really is better. There were socialists who were thus persuaded a few years ago. So it's possible that one can, in fact, modify our desires through a process of validity testing direction. This happens clearly in other worlds besides politics. It happens in the world of science. And so scientists can be disabused of false notions through evidence, through logic, through experimentation. Now, some is stubborn, some hold on. But basically, that's what science and even scholarship in general, as its telos, holds to. And we've learned in the modern world that other alternatives, where it's because I say it so, or because my father told me so, or because the church tells me, those are pretty dubious, and we're not so happy with falling back in that. So it may be a myth that we fall back in reason. But it's, as is narrativization, in a way, a useful myth. It allows us to get beyond the simple, I'm here, and I stehe, this kind of almost religious notion of, I have no alternative but to stick with my guns. Now, not always, and democracy is still, in some ways, as Derrida points out, of need, it's to come. It's not yet here, never will be here, in the perfect sense. But at least as some sort of impulse in the modern version of democracy, it seems to be part of the game now, and Habermas wants to make it a bigger part.
Jürgen, seems to me that the argument that you presented, Habermas, the result of this is an elegant way of replacing rationality by tolerance. Basically, I would disagree with my colleague Brian Knipals. I think that there is a public good, and the public good has been much more minimal. It is to legitimate the result in a non-violent way through discourse.
It's procedural. It's a procedural.
Procedural, yeah, in a sense that the real good that comes out of a contemporary pluralistic democracy is a non-violent process of legitimating the result that could be tragic, because in that sense there is no difference between the Platonic system of hierarchy, which gave up participation in the name of knowledge, but we know that the philosophers also produce tragic results, and the democracy also produced very tragic results. So the only difference is the different systems of legitimation. And I think in this respect, I met Habermas during the time that he came to the funeral of Gershon Shalom. And I just came back from studying abroad, and we had a very nice conversation. And I said to him, to me, I was very fresh and not sufficiently knowledgeable, and I said, you sound to me very much with the optimism of Condorcet. So he said, well, you have to remember, I'm a German philosopher after World War II. And I think there is a necessity to return to Germany a certain kind of a culture of discourse that will make democracy possible. So that from that moment, I felt that he had a very instrumental goal in his mind, and in philosophy, I think he succeeded.
Well, certainly instrumental in the sense it's practical.
Yes.
But the point about the type of practical reasoning is that it involves persuading rather than manipulating. So it's true that at times there is that's an indirect way of bringing it about, but there's the hope that it involves consensus and persuasion rather than seduction or mystification. Now, tolerance is interesting. Tolerance, of course, is a great achievement of the early modern period, more or less religious in other terms, with limits. It has always, however, seemed, from this more, let's say, ambitious point of view, necessary but inadequate or insufficient. It's necessary because, obviously, you have to take the other as bringing to the table a different set of values, different set of practices which one doesn't simply a priori dismiss. And therefore, the toleration of the other, the toleration of difference, is one step in the way towards a more peaceful relation between the civilized and the barbarians, by getting rid of the idea that they're barbarians. On the other hand, if I tolerate you, it means that I have, in some ways, the position of power. You know, it's like the Jews were tolerated in Spain during, the Golden Age, but, in some ways, although it was a benign toleration, more or less, still. So toleration has a slightly condescending asymmetrical quality. And the point is, I'm not really listening to you. I may tolerate you, but, let's say dominant Christian civilization.
Reciprocal toleration. Reciprocal toleration.
Well, but that's unusual if you're going to have an absolute, symmetry. Usually, somebody has the power and tolerates somebody else. And also, it doesn't involve a kind of learning process. It doesn't involve my listening to what you have to say and maybe changing my position. I mean, I tolerate you, but I'm not going to learn from you. In other words, let's say the Catholic hierarchy in late medieval Spain is not learning much from the Jews. I think I'm not a serious student of that. So I think that's the I would say necessary but not sufficient quality toleration in the argument. So the hope is that at some point one becomes humble enough about one's own positions to have a reciprocity which involves basically not saying that you're bringing something to the table which involves interests or involves ego or involves your own, let's say, given values, but you are vulnerable enough, willing enough, and secure enough even, you might say, to listen and learn. And democracy is based, maybe a myth because we don't always have that, on the hope that that's a possibility in interaction. That it's not based on hierarchy, revelation, tradition, but based on some sort of capacity to open oneself up to the values of others. No, we don't ever achieve the single general will, the single consensus. It's always a kind of teleological hope towards which we may be going, and from which we often regress. But once again, the alternatives don't seem to be very attractive. But some of the arguments that we hear now are arguments that I'll introduce from other people's points of view. In the third lecture, this Habermas has, of course, been attacked, among other ways, on these grounds.
Gabi?
I don't know quite how to formulate it. Let's put it this way. You talk about a world of pluralist discourse in which different people are talking and which they persuade each other through argument. And I was thinking, what models does that remind me of? And in the first place, it reminded me of Adam Smith's Marketplace. But the difference between Adam Smith's Marketplace and the way to characterize Habermas is that Adam Smith's Marketplace, many people lose individually. In other words, bad ideas, bad products are eliminated in the same way as in evolution. Natural selection means that almost all species are extinct, and very few actually survive. Whereas the model you purvey is more like a nonprofit is only too happy for its ideas to be adopted by others. In other words, that there is sort of the expansion of the thing is deselective, so that you persuade ideas, you get them out there through discourse, but that there's no principle really by which you eliminate or select.
Well, I think it's in the going. In other words, there's absolutely no a priori principle. In the learning process, and I'll talk more about learning as a crucial issue next time, it's quite clear that when we learned how to make atomic bombs, we learned something, but this was a devil's pattern of, potential for the extinction of the human race. So was it worth learning? Well, something we then have to think about through our values, our arguments, our ability to be practical in terms of trying to stop nuclear proliferation and so forth. So you're absolutely right. There is always a potential for some position to lose in the argument. And now the market analogy is interesting. The free market of ideas, a very liberal notion. The distinction, I think, is this: that in the consumption model, that everybody decides to buy a certain thing, and that, maybe through advertising or they're persuaded, that thing ends up succeeding, other things are not successful. The model of consumption is different from the model of democratic liberation. Because in a way, is based on the idea that we have these desires which are there to be manipulated. We don't have reasons for buying a fancy car that's going to be, we just simply are, sort of seduced into thinking it's going to get us the beautiful girl by doing that. So in some ways, the consumption model is, first of all, too individualistic. And then second of all, involved with a certain, let's say, more rational premise than the democratic deliberative model. So I think models of democracy based on rational choice theory, which is really what consumption models are like, underestimates the extent to which we can change our desires and think about our priorities. But the idea of the good, the idea of the substantive, ethical, or whatever you want to call it, model, is precisely what Habermas is very nervous about. Because the good can be discussed, it can be argued about, but there's no a priori, McIntyre version of going back to it, or Leo Strauss, or these other figures who think that there is a version of it that we've forgotten. We as moderns have to create the ideals of the good through our own experience. And this is a healthy thing, there may be multiple models of good. Each culture will be different. I mean, the great glory of the human species, in a way, is its plurality. I mean, how awful it would be if we lived in just a single culture, with a single language, with a single religion. I mean, it would be a nightmare. So that the idea of plurality as something, post-Babel that we should try to undo is, in fact, an impoverished notion of how humans have dealt with the challenge of our instinctual insufficiencies, which means that we need culture, and we need different cultures. So the real question is how we adjudicate among and negotiate between and pacify the relations that may create antagonisms between those cultures. And in a way, this discursive model is about as good as we've come up with. It's not perfect, obviously.
But you need time.
Well, this is why it's future-oriented. It's always, and this, of course, is why Schmitt and other people were opposed to any deliberative democracy. Well, act. You have to decide. You have to, will the baby be brought to term?
Remember what Oscar Wilde said about socialism. It ruins the evenings.
Takes them evenings.
That's right.
So you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a, let's say, practical limit. I mean, there are many other practical limits. I mean, one, just to sort of anticipate, I think I may discuss this next time. I mean, the Habermasian arguments, Shelobin and Habib, other people have, worked along with this. They use Hannah Arendt, the idea that it's a large consciousness, not a universal one above the fray, and that the The goal is, and I briefly mentioned this, to take every other position into account rather than try to come to a general position. Now, what does that mean practically? How am I going to take, I need a room with, what do we have, 50, 70, 100 people in this room. How would I take everybody's position? How can I do that in a society of 2 million, or 4 million, or 8 million, or a world population of how many billions? It's meaningless. I mean, I can't do that. I can have a kind of guess, but that guess may simply be my imposition onto you. So that's a temporal problem, and in a way, a spatial problem. So if you had world enough and time, yes, we could ask for everybody's opinion. But I mean, the other problem, once again, I'm sort of almost anticipating something once again, maybe the other problem is that there are issues in the democracy which are too technical for us to figure out. I mean, if you ask me what Obamacare actually does, you know, I don't know. I mean, I like it, and I dislike the people who dislike it, but I don't really know what it's doing, you know, on the kind of technical level about all the things that it mandates this, but I know some things, but I don't, it's a 1,000-page law or something. So in some ways, we go on faith. We go on, you know, representatives who tell us what we should do. We vote a ticket. So democracy, you know, this is not news to anybody. It doesn't have this kind of quality of a debating society. And the public sphere model has always been a model that, you know, is tendentially interesting, but practically very limited.
I was told that I have to close, so only two very, very short questions, please. Yeah. David and both, and please ask, and Martin, just react.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, a little remark to your remark about Habermas is a philosopher of Adenauer. It was provocative. It was not. I think it is a compliment, especially to the fashion that you know, Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was the legal philosopher of Hitler. So this is my remark about these petit bourgeois philosophers. No, but my question, if you can elaborate a little. Last time you mentioned the term aesthetic rationality.
Right.
And I would like to comment on. I asked this question Habermas last time when he was here in Van Leer Institute, how he explained the fascination of Foucault and Derrida to Benjamin critique of violence, for example.
Right.
Of course, it's connected to the aestheticization of the postmodernization of violence, and he said he doesn't have, he didn't know the answer. Maybe you have.
And you, please, the last question. No? Okay. Yeah.
I think this very interesting notion of a pluralist discourse assumes some sort of a neutral space in which everyone has a voice. So what happens when there are individuals that do not have a voice, like that when they are silenced by, say, what Lyotard calls différent?
Right. Well, first, aesthetic rationality. I mean, there are many models of aesthetic rationality, which go against the idea that the aesthetic is always mystifying, always irrational. There's a moment of rationality in the aesthetic, and Adorno and aesthetic theory spells that in many different respects. Within the artwork itself, a moment of rationality, which could take a while to discuss, but also, as Kant points out in the third critique, a moment of rationality in the ways in which we talk about, judge, and validate works of art, which is beautiful, which is original, which is valuable, which is whatever. Why we put this in the museum and put this in the garbage heap. So we're always judging, we're always validating, we're always talking about it. So within the aesthetic sphere, there are, let's say, criteria of, or principles of, or paradigms of judgment. So to that extent, reflective rather than determined judgments are used to describe what we construe as a beautiful or valuable work of art. And these have, as Hannah Arendt and others, have parallels to the way we deal with politics. So the aesthetic has a moment of the rational rather than simply being the opposite of reason. And one would have to think about violence and how that may be, in some very deep sense, anti-rational, because it stops people from discussing. You know, if I stick a knife in you, we're not talking. So there is some sense in which, this moment of rationality, the space of rationality, is a space surrounded by, a pretty hostile environment. I mean, the space of rationality, the space for giving reasons, is not everything, and therefore violence, alas, plays a role. And one might argue democratic politics is, still struggling with violence. It uses it, I mean, as Derrida himself points out, law is enforced. And we use force to keep law down. We're not angels. We will stray unless there is also force backing the law. So even democracy uses force both in external and internal affairs all the time, and with criminalization. So it's certainly part of it, and Benjamin was making some very interesting remarks about that. Now, the inclusion or exclusion argument. I mean, this, of course, is a great debate over the public sphere. It was the bourgeois public sphere. Not everybody got involved. Women were not yet involved. People who were not people with property. So Habermas understands that it's limited sociologically. The principle of public sphere is, however, one of total inclusivity. And public sphere's history is one until he sees it hijacked by modern media of greater and greater inclusion. And the point is that the principle of public sphere is that it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you're coming from, it doesn't matter what your cultural capital is prior to the discussion, better arguments. And it's a principle, for example, in the scholarly world of blind submission. You send an article to your journal without your name on it. So I'm not going to reject it because I don't like you, I'm not going to accept it because you're a famous person, I want to have you in my journal. I'm going to look at the article. I can send it out to readers, and well, now this is, of course, not always done, but that's the idea. But empirically, you're absolutely right. It's very clear that some people have the education, they have the means, the leisure to participate, others don't. But in principle, inclusivity should allow, and of course we do know that some groups that were previously excluded have in fact had the opportunity, they were forced it sometimes, it hasn't been granted through toleration, they sometimes forced it to join the fray, as it were. Habermas makes the point that the process of enlightenment were all participants. That there's no, and this is where Kant is wrong, there are no people who are enlightened who are the tutors to the immature. There are no people who have the ability to tell people what they should know. So it's a learning process, which is one that we all are involved with. And once again, maybe too ideal, empirically we recognize our limits, but at least we also understand those limits are problematic.
Thank you very much, Marty. Thank you very much.